Oppression in the Americas before and during the Civil Rights Movement. Civil Rights Push for Paradigm Shift. Hello, we are Mary Claire, Nathan, and Luke, and today we hope to show a cohesive understanding of the usefulness of four sources pertaining to the African American rights movement and the women's rights movement, as well as highlight the ways of knowing that shaped society's truth during that time. The social rights movements in America represent a time in history where society was dominated by a white patriarchal system that relied on the voice of religion and governmental policy. During the civil rights movements, a mass shift in perspective occurred amongst the people of America when disenfranchised and oppressed groups pushed against prejudices to achieve goals of rights and equality. Our first source is a website that looks at the Black civil rights movement from the perspective of white Southern Americans who were against the equalization of the African American people. The source gives the impression that this was due to social factors of the time, such as religion and the popularity of organized groups. White Southern Americans are highlighted as resistive to the desegregation of the African American people, and issues of fear are addressed, suggesting that people were scared of African American equality. The author also questions if Southern Americans felt that they were instead intrinsically better than African Americans. Consequently, it can be argued that Southern Americans were both fearful of black equality and felt they were better. The source underpins a central truth of the time. African American people were viewed negatively by the white Southern populace because of their race and were oppressed within society. These truths are further reinforced by the major opinion makers of the time, which the source mentions in detail, such as the Ku Klux Klan and the church. Religion played a prominent role in Southern American society, and the KKK used that to their advantage by demonizing African American people while promoting a Christian perspective. The source is managed by the U.S. Department of the State and was written by Jason Sokol, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, and can be considered a reliable opinion. Although the website does not provide a reference list, which makes it questionable, Sokol can be considered a reputable author due to his experience with this topic through his PhD and his text, White Southerners in the Age of Civil Rights. This website is useful in gaining an understanding of history in Southern America during the time of the civil rights and is excellent for preliminary research. The website utilizes black and white photos taken at KKK meetings and protests against desegregation, along with accounts that show the authenticity of the source. This source validly represents the viewpoint of Southern American people with credibility, while highlighting the place that religion held in society at the time. This is not the first time religion has shaped the views of a society and can also be seen within the women's rights movement of America. Our second source is titled Social Movements, a book written by Graham Chesters and Ian Welsh, where key social movements in Europe and America in the 18th and 19th centuries are explored. The source uses historical background to highlight possible progressions for social change in the future. Chesters examines the causes behind ways of knowing during the time of the social movements. He also presents a concluding opinion or truth which was widespread throughout society at the time. This can be seen through the women's movement, where Chesters states the prevalence of patriarchal social relations and their normative status in Western societies made the inequality and subordination or oppression of women effectively invisible. The notion of patriarchal dominance has been seen in many societies where the dominant ideas came from the men who enforced the rules. Religion was a binding factor that brought the people and government together, as well as creating opportunities for a religious hive mentality. The source provides a comprehensive analysis of social change, which is required in understanding Chester's key elements. The text is also useful in drawing contextual conclusions about human rights. The truth of the 18th and 19th century in America is that women were oppressed. Dominant viewpoints were reinforced by the opinion of the church and men in charge, which were then perpetuated by society. Chesters also notes that African American people were oppressed by the very same system, perhaps to a more outspoken and sometimes religiously demonizing degree. Our third source explains the civil rights movement directly in relation to the development of America, as well as its everlasting influence on society. The article describes a time in American history when many civilians began to rally in support of rights for African American people. This action was later entitled the African American Civil Rights Movement. Society silenced individuals due to race, and because of people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, questions began to rise that challenged the dominant white viewpoint. This shift in perspective resulted in a decline of persuasive power. However, it occurred slowly, as did the shift in mass perspective. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X's views both represent a society for equality despite having different views on implementation. The source suggests that African American people turned to these black leaders because of the negligence they felt in society. This further underpins notions of truth in that time and highlights the place African American people had within it, as opposed to the place of white American people whose views were privileged and shaped by the dominant perpetuating beliefs. African American people were able to vote by 1870, however, schools were segregated between race, which further reinforced what was known at the time as white and black America. The source is factual and its content is referenced, with solid analysis. Rod Bush is a respected academic in the social rights field and has other texts on American social rights, which points toward a trustworthy opinion. This source, about African American rights, is useful in gaining an understanding of a black perspective during the time of the civil rights movements and highlights fundamental flaws in society at that time. However, this is not the only instance where American society silenced a minority and can also be seen within the women's rights movement. The last source outlines Elizabeth Cady Stanton's life, from her role as a wife and domestic figurehead to her exploits as a women's rights activist, where she called for change and equality. When finding useful and reliable sources, Wikipedia is not always the best option because the wiki is an open source platform, meaning that anyone can edit the source. However, Wikipedia reserved the right to edit or remove entries that are incorrect. The source proves credible, as it has completely referenced material with footnotes and external links to further research. The source uses an informative approach with no bias. A background of the subject's life is provided from Stanton's writing and other reference texts. From the summary information presented, the source is most useful for learning background context. However, the source does highlight the truth of the time, which was the oppression of women, and shows ways of knowing. Stanton was prompted into a perspective change at the Worldwide Anti-Slavery Convention, where a man spoke on behalf of all women and prompted her to formulate a new outlook on equality. Stanton went on to tell the country that women deserved equality because they were different, because they were not men, and successfully orchestrated the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. Stanton was an avid women's rights activist who not only fought for voting rights, but also parental and custody rights for women, property rights, employment and income rights, divorce, the economic health of family, and birth control. Elizabeth Cady Stanton pushed for change in the face of a patriarchal dominated society, which favored the opinions of white men with acceptable means and silenced those that did not fall within normal parameters. The subject of this Wikipedia is an amazing example of a game changer where one person enabled an entire nation to see a new outlook on equality. The oppression and dehumanization of disenfranchised groups was an accepted paradigm during times of patriarchal dominance. The truth and weight of knowing during the civil rights movement can be attributed to a heavy religious presence and the publicly fed information chosen by powerful groups such as the government or unofficial but societal accepted groups like the KKK. During the time of the civil rights movements, human rights groups pushed for exposure and went to many lengths to uncover the truth. However, it was not until those viewpoints were prominent in the media and circulating through society that people began to form their own opinions. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton helped change Western perspectives, and it's because of social leaders like these that we are able to talk to you freely today. Once again, we are Mary Claire, Nathan, and Luke. Today, we have talked about oppression in the Americas, looking at truth and the ways of knowing through the scope of the African American movement and the women's movement. We have viewed the usefulness, credibility, and validity of sources that perpetuate dominant beliefs of the 18th and 19th century, as well as sources that show a push for paradigm change. Thank you very much for listening, and we will leave you with a quote. Time is on the side of the oppressed today. It's against the oppressor. Truth is on the side of the oppressed today. It's against the oppressor. You don't need anything else. Malcolm X.